You probably think a malicious computer virus, a highly radioactive chemical element, and a couple of immigrant teenagers living in Cleveland in the 1930s have absolutely nothing in common.
Right. I mean, on the surface, that is just a completely random assortment of things.
Exactly. But if you strip away the math, the computer code, and the comic book ink, they're all running on the exact same invisible operating system. And because you are someone who likes to learn how things actually work, someone who wants to look past the visible gears of the world, you know that the real machinery driving human history isn't made of metal or silicon.
No, it really isn't.
It is made of stories.
It's the fundamental architecture of human cognition. I mean, our brains simply do not run on raw, unvarnished data. We process reality through narrative.
Right.
We need a beginning, a middle, and an end, just to make sense of the chaos around us.
Which brings us to the mission of today's deep dive. We are taking a hard look at the hidden machinery of human storytelling. We really want to understand how our modern narratives are built, how they act as a mirror for our deepest collective anxieties, and, incredibly, how ancient myths literally construct the vocabulary of our hardest sciences today.
It's a huge topic.
It is, and we are pulling from an incredible stack of sources for this. We've got scholarly theses on pop culture history, fierce academic critiques of famous storytelling tropes, and historical analyses of how ancient Greece still maps our modern reality.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, it's a perfect collection of research because it forces us to confront this profound chicken and egg scenario.
Like, do we consciously shape our myths to fit our world?
Or do our myths actually shape the way we perceive the world? And to answer that, we really have to start by looking at the birth of a modern myth. We have to examine how a cultural god is forged, and not out of divine inspiration from the heavens, but out of sheer, grinding, earthly desperation.
Right, so we are starting with the most iconic modern myth of the 20th century, which is the superhero. Specifically, Superman.
The Man of Steel himself?
Yeah. Now, if you picture the origin of Superman, you're probably default to the cinematic version, right? A dying alien planet, advanced crystal technology, a baby in a rocket ship.
The classic sci-fi origin?
Exactly. But the true historical reality of Action Comics #1, published in April 1938, is much more grounded in human misery. We're talking about two Jewish immigrant teenagers, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, living in Cleveland, Ohio, right in the bleakest depths of the Great Depression.
You really have to put yourself in their shoes to understand the mechanism of this creation. It was a time of immense, suffocating helplessness. Millions of people were unemployed, banks were collapsing.
People were losing everything.
Entirely losing their faith in the institutions that were supposed to protect them. And Siegel and Shuster were just kids looking around at a world that seemed fundamentally broken and unfair, and baked into that cultural despair was a deeply tragic personal inspiration.
Yeah, this part of the source material was heavy.
It really is. In 1932, Jerry Siegel's father actually died a heart attack during a robbery at his family's secondhand clothing store.
Wow. That detail just fundamentally rewires how you view the character. Because the earliest sketches Shuster ever drew actually depict Superman saving a man at gunpoint who looked strikingly similar to Siegel's late father.
It is the ultimate psychological wish fulfillment born directly from trauma. If the real world is chaotic and cruel, you invent a bulletproof champion who can enforce fairness.
Yeah.
But it's vital to note that the early Superman was quite different from the omnipotent, godlike being we know today. He couldn't fly yet.
Wait, he couldn't fly?
No. He merely leapt 1/8 of a mile. His creators were actually heavily inspired by a 1930 science fiction novel called Gladiator by Philip Wylie.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Yeah, that book featured a protagonist named Hugo Danner who had superhuman strength and impenetrable skin.
But the narrative of Gladiator was incredibly bleak. Hugo Danner felt completely alienated by his gifts. His powers made his life miserable, he accidentally killed people, and he essentially gave up on humanity because he couldn't find a place in the world.
Right, exactly.
But Siegel and Shuster took those exact same physical mechanics and just injected them with this radical, almost desperate optimism.
They engineered a creature of light out of a template of darkness. But the tragedy of their creation extended into their real lives, too. I mean, they originally conceived Superman as a prestigious newspaper comic strip.
Like Flash Gordon or something.
Exactly. Instead, a publisher pushed it into a brand new, highly disrespected magazine format, the comic book. And because it was an unproven, disposable medium, Siegel and Shuster famously sold the rights to everything connected to Superman to Detective Comics for a mere $130.
$130. For the foundation of a multi-billion-dollar century-standing empire. That is just brutal. But Let's look at what they actually created with that character, because I want to challenge the prevailing pop culture idea that Superman was always this clean-cut, flawless Boy Scout who always worked with the police.
Oh, he definitely wasn't.
Not at all. If you look at those early 1938 issues, he was a radical vigilante. In Action Comics number 13, he's out in the streets smashing up taxis to fight an aggressive, corrupt taxi monopoly.
Right.
In Action Comics number 3, he literally drops a corrupt mine owner into his own collapsed, unsafe mine just to teach him a terrifying lesson about worker safety. I mean, it sounds like they weren't trying to make a flawless god. They were trying to make a fictional one-man New Deal program.
He was entirely operating outside the law because during the Great Depression, the law wasn't protecting the vulnerable. He was explicitly an anti-big business crusader. He didn't even use the famous phrase, truth, justice, and the American way back then. No, he threw corrupt lobbyists out of windows. He was the raw, unfiltered, angry voice of the oppressed working class.
So if this character was invented as a radical anti-establishment brawler to mentally fix the miseries of the Great Depression, what happens when the culture around him fundamentally changes?
Well, what's fascinating here is that a superhero operates less like a fixed character and more like a cultural thermometer.
A thermometer.
Yeah. You stick him into a specific decade, and whatever temperature the American public is running, whether that is fear, patriotism, or conformity, that is exactly what the character's narrative displays.
That makes a lot of sense.
The hero must evolve to reflect the shifting anxieties of the society reading him. If he doesn't, the myth becomes irrelevant and dies. And we see this mechanism trigger dramatically when World War II begins.
Right.
After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the anti-establishment vigilante instantly transforms into the ultimate government-sanctioned super patriot.
The shift is whiplash-inducing. Suddenly, he's a spokesperson for the U.S. government. He's on the covers of magazines telling children to buy war bonds. In Action Comics number 62, he's actively fighting a grotesque caricature of a Nazi. And the writers actually have Superman reference his own alien origin and subtly the Jewish heritage of his creators by proudly declaring himself non-Aryan right to the Nazis' face.
And that specific storytelling choice had profound real-world consequences. The real-life SS newspaper in Nazi Germany, Das Schwarze Korps, actually published a furious article attacking Jerry Siegel by name.
Wow.
Yeah, they claimed he was using Superman to push a Jewish agenda and brainwash American children. The ink on the comic book page was actively engaging in a global geopolitical propaganda war.
But then the war ends, we move into the 1950s and 60s, and the culture shifts again. The world isn't fighting a visible enemy anymore. They are terrified of the invisible threat of the atom bomb. And suddenly Superman gets, well, kind of domesticated.
Domesticated is a good word for it. The Cold War brought an immense, suffocating cultural push for conformity and stability. People were terrified of nuclear annihilation, so society retreated into the perceived safety of the traditional nuclear family.
Right, duck and cover.
Exactly. And this was heavily enforced by the Comics Code Authority, which strictly regulated what could be shown in print. Superman is no longer throwing corrupt politicians down mine shafts. In Action Comics number 143, he's dealing with atomic anxieties alongside a female nuclear scientist named Nikki LaRue.
Okay.
And the gender dynamics undergo a massive regression. In Action Comics number 149, Lois Lane, who originated as this fierce, independent, globe-trotting reporter, is literally trying to win Superman's heart by cooking and cleaning for him.
Wait. The guy who was dismantling monopolies is now dealing with domestic sitcom plots?
Yes.
She finds a film of Superman's Kryptonian mother cooking and figures, hey, if I perfectly replicate his mom's cooking, I can trap him into marriage. It's absurd.
It really is.
And because the publisher leaned so hard into this safe, conservative conformity, the myth started to stagnate. They started losing readers. This rigidness is exactly what created the vacuum that allowed Marvel Comics to rise up in the 60s, creating flawed, angsty heroes who actually resonated with the counterculture.
Precisely. The thermometer had to adjust again.
As we move into the 1970s, America is dealing with a brutal cocktail of post-Vietnam malaise, the betrayal of Watergate, and severe economic stagflation. Society felt crippled, and the comic reflected that exact psychological state.
How so?
Well, in Action Comics number 396, Superman is temporarily stripped of his powers and reduced to a panhandler in a wheelchair, being mocked by the everyday people of Metropolis.
Wow. It is a literal visual metaphor for a weakened, disillusioned America.
And then the pendulum swings again in the 1980s during the Reagan era. You have Frank Miller's highly influential graphic novel, The Dark Knight Returns. Superman is depicted as this massive militaristic tool who acts blindly on behalf of the U.S. government's foreign policy, even going to war with Batman.
Right.
And just to pause here for a second, looking at our sources, we are absolutely not taking a side on whether Frank Miller's right-wing take or a previous era's left-wing take is the correct version of the character.
Oh, exactly. We're just reporting on how the writers used him.
Yeah, we're not endorsing any specific politics, just highlighting how the character reflects the debates of the time. It just proves the mechanism itself. Writers were actively using this singular character as a political lightning rod to process the intense debates of their specific era.
It proves that the hero is essentially an empty vessel. And that vessel had to be shattered entirely as we moved into the 1990s and 2000s. The Cold War ended, but then 9/11 happened. The scholarly sources referred to the 2000s as the decade of fear.
And the narratives turn incredibly dark to match that national trauma. The famous Death of Superman storyline in the 90s literally kills off the invincible icon and introduces 4 messy replacements. A cloned Superboy, a man in armor named Steel, a ruthless vigilante called the Eradicator, and a cyborg.
That fractured lineup perfectly mirrored a fragmented American identity, trying to figure out what a hero should even look like in a morally gray world. And the storytelling in the 2000s becomes heavily focused on sudden, unavoidable loss.
Like with Pa Kent.
Yes. Take Action Comics number 870, where Superman's adoptive father, Pa Kent, dies of a sudden heart attack during an alien invasion. The writers realized the only way to make a god relatable to a post-9/11 audience was to make him completely powerless to save the person he loved the most from a random, chaotic tragedy. The focus shifted entirely to processing grief.
So if Superman's constant reinvention proves there is no single fixed way a hero must act, if the narrative is always adapting, why does it feel like modern media is stuck in a loop? I mean, for decades, academia, Hollywood, and pop culture have worshipped a single, incredibly rigid storytelling template.
You're referring to Joseph Campbell's famous hero's journey.
The monomyth.
Exactly. Campbell proposed this grand, unifying theory of narrative, that every culture in the world throughout all of time basically tells the exact same story. A singular hero leaves home, faces trials, achieves a violent victory, and returns transformed.
And honestly, the scholars in our sources are tearing this theory apart. One critic, C.P. Neild, flat out calls it a Hollywood McMyth, a mass-produced, heavily processed storyline designed for easy consumption.
It's a severe critique, but the folklorists back it up. Alan Dundas argues that Campbell played incredibly fast and loose with his anthropological data.
Fast and loose how?
Well, Campbell would examine stories from First Nation and Indigenous cultures, strip away all their specific, nuanced cultural context, and violently force them into his own Western psychoanalytic box just to make his theory work.
It's basically an academic saying, hey, your culture story is great, but let me chop off the edges so it fits my flowchart.
Yeah.
I point out that Campbell's myth is intensely individualistic. It's almost always about a singular, usually male hero achieving conquest through violence. But the author, Ursula K. Le Guin, offered a brilliant counter-narrative, the carrier bag theory of fiction. She argues that the earliest human stories weren't about a lone, glorious hunter killing a mammoth with a spear.
Because the spear's dramatic.
Exactly. It was actually the act of gathering, putting oats and berries into a shared container that kept early communities alive. She argues for life stories about community, sharing, and the collective, rather than the traditional killer story of a lone hero's violent triumph.
This raises an important question. What psychological richness are we losing when we force global stories into one rigid structure? When every blockbuster movie or bestseller must follow a singular hero's violent triumph, we subconsciously condition ourselves to expect that real-world, systemic problems can only be solved by a lone savior, rather than through messy, collective community action.
It's like trying to force every piece of music ever written into a standard 4/4 pop song structure. Sure, it makes a catchy, profitable tune for the radio, but you completely lose the jazz, the classical, the complex polyrhythmic beats of different cultures. It flattens the human experience.
Yeah, it really does.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Modern storytellers are finally breaking the McMyth, and they are doing it through technology.
Exactly. The rise of role-playing games, or RPGs, and virtual reality are fundamentally rewiring how we consume narrative. The sources highlight a specific VR experience called Table for Two. In these interactive mediums, the audience is no longer a passive observer. The technology demands a shift from a director-centric approach, where you are forced down one path, to a navigator-centric approach.
You're inside the story. And the academic sources bring up this fascinating concept called queer temporality.
Yeah, that's a great concept.
Now, normally, our traditional stories follow a strict, straight timeline, what they call heteronormative milestones: birth, coming of age, marriage, reproduction, death, a conveyor belt. But these new interactive mediums embrace the detour.
Right.
Queer temporality basically means you have the freedom to linger in a side quest. You can delay the climax. You can exist in the world and explore non-linear paths without being forced toward a preordained cultural finish line. We are finally outgrowing the myth.
But even as we successfully deconstruct the structural rules of modern myths in media, we have to recognize a deeper layer. The actual specific content of ancient myths is still hardwired into our society, so deeply, in fact, that it forms the literal everyday vocabulary of our hardest, most objective sciences.
This is the pivot that really bends your mind. If we shift from narrative structure to scientific vocabulary, mythology is everywhere. Take computer science. The Trojan horse virus.
Right.
It acts like a benign gift, but once inside, it secretly destroys your system from within. That is a direct functional lift from the ancient epics, the Iliad and the Aeneid.
The mechanism is identical. In the ancient myth, the Trojan priest Lokun warned his people that the deadly wooden horse was a trap, and they ignored him because they wanted the prize.
Right.
The modern computer virus relies on that exact same enduring human flaw, ignoring security warnings to let something malicious past your defenses because it looks appealing.
Yeah, we still click the bad
We
link.
always click the link. Or look at chemistry. We have the element titanium, named for the immense strength of the Titans, but even more illustrative is promethium.
I looked this up, and promethium is highly radioactive, right?
Yes, it is. And it's named after Prometheus, the Titan who defied the gods to steal fire and give it to humanity. The name isn't just a tribute. It perfectly symbolizes the dual nature of the element itself. It represents the incredible, illuminating promise of nuclear energy, permanently fused with its deadly radioactive peril. The myth acts as a psychological warning label built right into the periodic table.
And it extends way beyond chemistry. Astronomy and navigation are entirely mapped by ancient gods. We operate on the heliocentric model, named directly for Helios, the Greek sun god.
Right.
Ancient navigators, and later the absolute giants of hard science like Kepler, Galileo, and Newton, all relied on the celestial sphere mapped out by mythological constellations. Orion the hunter. Ophiuchus, which is still connected to medicine today. Capricorn, representing the goat god Pan. Leo, representing the Nemean lion from Hercules' very first labor.
Even modern medicine traces its foundational vocabulary back to the Greeks. Hippocrates and the ancient concept of bodily humors mapping to human temperaments. Words we use every day, like pharmacy and hygiene, all derive directly from Greek mythological figures.
I have to stop you there, though. Naming a computer virus Trojan horse or a planet after a Roman god feels like a clever branding exercise, sure. But to claim that hard science actually needs storytelling, isn't science supposed to be the exact opposite of myth? Isn't it supposed to be just cold, hard, empirical data?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the line between data and myth is much thinner than we think. Consider the cognitive process of abstraction.
Okay.
In ancient mythology, humans took a terrifying, complex, natural disaster like a massive thunderstorm and personified it into a god with a face, like Zeus. They gave it a name so they could understand and negotiate with it.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah, that is the exact same cognitive mechanism used in modern medical diagnostics. A doctor takes a patient's incredibly complex, messy, individual experience of pain and symptoms and abstracts it into a distinct, categorizable disease with a specific name. The fundamental human method is the same. We use narrative symbols to tame the chaos of the unknown.
Wow. Okay, that completely reframes how you look at a doctor's chair. So what does this all mean? We've covered incredible ground today.
We really have.
We started with two kids in Cleveland, dreaming up a bulletproof champion, just to mentally punch back at the miseries of the Great Depression. We watched that hero act as a cultural thermometer, twisting to reflect World War II patriotism, Cold War paranoia, and post-9/11 grief.
Right.
We saw how the hero's journey is really just a rigid Hollywood construct that we are finally breaking apart through the multilinear freedom of VR and video games. And we traced how the cognitive process of ancient myth-making provides the literal blueprint for how we diagnose diseases and map the stars today.
And this matters profoundly for how you navigate the world today. The reality you experience every single day, the way a news cycle is framed, the way political campaigns structure their promises, even the way a medical diagnosis is communicated to you, is constructed upon these underlying narrative rules.
Yeah.
If you don't realize that you are operating inside a story, you can never see who is actually writing it. Recognizing the myth is the absolute first step to truly understanding the information you are being fed.
You have to see the X-ray of the story. Which leaves us with one final thought to ponder as you go about your week. If our ancient spear-throwing myths lay the vocabulary for today's hard science, and today's shifting heroes reflect our current cultural anxieties, what new myths are artificial intelligence and space colonization currently writing for the generations of the future? When AI algorithms are the ones generating the stories we consume, will the hero of the next century even be human? Something to think about.